They say the wars of the future won't start with tanks, but with information, and perhaps that future has already arrived. When Donald Trump authorized covert CIA operations in Venezuela, the world watched, without realizing it, as a new kind of conflict emerged. Silent, invisible, and strategically calculated. What seemed like a simple anti-drug measure was, in fact, the tip of a geopolitical iceberg that combined power, oil, and influence in the same equation. And the most intriguing thing? Almost no one noticed the exact moment when the line between defense and domination was crossed. The real question isn't what Trump did, but why he did it, and what this act reveals about how power operates behind the scenes. For the first time in decades, an American president has brought to light the rawest face of foreign policy, one that doesn't ask permission, just acts. The rhetoric of freedom served as the perfect disguise for the silent advance of American influence across the continent. And while the world debated tweets and headlines, history was being rewritten in the shadows, under the relentless logic of strategy. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect lies not in the operation itself, but in its legacy. Because if one man was able to transform the CIA into an extension of his political will, what's to stop the next leader from doing the same, on an even grander scale? The line between security and manipulation has never been so blurred. And it is in this nebulous space that powers shape the future, while the public still tries to understand the past. I am subscribed to the channel. Turn on notifications and continue learning with me about the behind-the-scenes of world power. How Trump authorized CIA operations in Venezuela. They say power reveals who we are, and perhaps no recent episode illustrates this better than Trump's decision to authorize covert CIA operations in Venezuela. Behind the scenes, long before any headlines, plans were already being hatched that combined politics, oil, and influence. Interestingly, behind the narrative of restoring democracy lay the old geopolitical chessboard, where every move is calculated with the cold-bloodedness of those who know that one misstep could reignite silent wars. Trump, like a seasoned poker player, knew he needed to bluff and act simultaneously. He authorized infiltration, intelligence, and destabilization missions under the pretext of combating cartels and corruption networks. But few among us ignored that the real prize was energy control and pressure on allied regimes of rival powers. The CIA became the invisible hand of a foreign policy that preferred to operate in the shadows rather than expose its intentions in the light of day. This type of operation, though shrouded in secrecy, leaves traces, and each decision echoes in rooms the public will never see. While some defended Trump as a protector of American values, others saw a leader willing to reignite the Cold War in the 21st century. What's even more intriguing is that, by authorizing such actions, he not only interfered in one country, but also redefined the boundaries of what constitutes national defense in times of global influence. And this is where an even more delicate question begins to emerge. When the rhetoric of freedom no longer convinces, there's always a new enemy to be named. In the case of Venezuela, Trump found drug trafficking as the perfect argument to cloak his intervention in the guise of morality. After all, who would dare question an operation against drug trafficking? The problem is that the line between ideal and self-interest becomes blurred. Under the pretext of fighting criminals, the White House reopened old roots of influence and expanded its tentacles into Latin America. It was a convenient narrative, pointing the finger at Maduro and linking his regime to international drug trafficking sounded like a call for justice. But behind the scenes, experts knew the trafficking was just a smokescreen. The real objective was strategic, to reposition the U.S. as the dominant force in a region where China and Russia were already extending their hands. Anti-drug rhetoric became once again a tool of camouflage diplomacy, an old piece in a modern game. If we look at history, we see this pattern repeated countless times. From Panama to Afghanistan, there has always been a threat, ready to justify the expansion of American influence. And, let's face it, The CIA masters the art of operating under noble narratives like no other. The curious thing is that the more people talk about protecting the world from drugs, the more the world seems to lose itself in the invisible networks of power. But what happens when other countries begin to notice this pattern and decide to react? No action occurs in a vacuum, especially when it involves the CIA. As soon as the first news of covert operations in Venezuela began to circulate, the international scene shifted. Russia and China reacted swiftly, denouncing what they called aggression, disguised as a fight against drug trafficking. For them, the American play was clear: neutralize a strategic ally in exchange for influence over the planet's largest oil reserves. And among diplomats, silence was worth more than any speech, because silence, in this game, speaks loudly. Europe, for its part, was divided between condemnation and political calculation. Some governments preferred not to alienate Washington, while others, particularly at the UN, warned of the risk of regional escalation. After all, a simple anti-drug operation could escalate into a diplomatic or even military conflict if Venezuelan sovereignty borders were crossed. And all it took was a single mistake, a single piece of leaked information, to reignite tensions that slumbered beneath the surface of international politics. But perhaps the most dangerous point was the precedent it set. If a president can authorize covert actions under vague justifications, what's to stop other leaders from doing the same? The world watched, torn between fear and pragmatism, as the pieces silently fell into place. And it's in this kind of silence that the greatest transformations happen, the ones no one sees coming until it's too late. Every covert action carries a risk that not even the most calculating strategist can foresee: the risk of a chain reaction. In the case of Venezuela, the world watched a chessboard where every piece moved by the United States could provoke a silent counterattack. Russia, for example, began increasing its military presence in the region with joint exercises and energy agreements. Small moves, but with enormous symbolic significance, as if to say, we know how to play this game too. And those who understand power know. True confrontation rarely begins with bombs, but with signals. Analysts call this a geopolitical domino effect, a chain of events beyond the control of the first mover. When Trump gave the CIA carte blanche, he didn't just interfere in one country. He lit a global firestorm. Every American action was closely watched by powers that had long been waiting for an excuse to expand their influence in Latin America. And in an era of volatile alliances, even a simple diplomatic statement can be interpreted as a hostile act. The ironic thing is that, while official discourse spoke of security, the world became increasingly unstable. With each covert operation, new alliances, new resistance, and new risks emerged. The line between preemptive action and provocation became more blurred, and, somewhere behind the scenes, someone was surely wondering, how far can this game go before the next spark ignites something impossible to extinguish? In the chess game of power, every move has a price, and Trump knew this better than anyone. His authorizations to the CIA were not just tactical decisions, they were declarations of authority. He wanted to show the world that the United States was still capable of acting without asking permission, even in times of multipolarity. It was as if he were saying, the empire still stands. This stance, while seen as bold by some, was interpreted by others as a dangerous regression, an echo of the times when fear justified any act of force. Politically, the legacy of these operations remains ambiguous. Domestically, Trump cemented his image as a ruthless leader, willing to protect American interests at any cost. But abroad, he left a trail of distrust. Many countries began to question the true extent of sovereignty when the U.S. decides to act preventatively. The impact of this still reverberates in international forums, in new defense policies, and in treaties that suddenly lost the symbolic validity they once held. And there's something almost paradoxical about all this. Trump, in attempting to reassert American power, ended up reigniting the debate over the limits of global intervention and espionage. His actions, though shrouded in controversy, opened the door to an uncomfortable reflection. That power, when exercised unchecked, exacts a price in reputation and stability. And perhaps it is precisely in this mixture of glory and consequence that the true mark of his administration lies hidden, a mark that time is still trying to decipher. While the powers debated the legitimacy of American actions, Latin America felt the real weight of Washington's decisions. Venezuela's neighbors were forced to choose sides, even when they simply wanted to preserve their own stability. Colombia, for example, became a strategic ally in intelligence operations, while Mexico and Argentina adopted a more cautious tone. It was like watching a game played on another table, but whose chips fell on the Latin American table itself. And in this game, neutrality is rarely an option. The immediate consequence was increased diplomatic tension and migration. Thousands of Venezuelans crossed borders seeking refuge, bringing with them stories that mixed fear, hope, and distrust. For many countries, the American presence rekindled old memories of coups backed by foreign powers, and governments that fell under the weight of hidden agendas. It was as if the ghost of the Cold War had once again whispered in embassies, reminding them that history never disappears, only changes its disguise. But curiously, this same movement also sparked a sense of regional unity. Organizations like Mercosur and CELAC began discussing new forms of cooperation, attempting to balance forces in the face of external influence. The region, previously seen as fragmented, began seeking a collective voice, albeit a timid one, against foreign interference. And perhaps, without realizing it, Trump provoked exactly the opposite of what he intended. A Latin American awakening that is beginning to understand that, to be respected on the global stage, one must learn to play together. In modern times, war is no longer fought solely with weapons, but with words. And Trump understood this masterfully. As soon as the operations in Venezuela came to light, a veritable battle of narratives began. On one side, the American media portrayed the president as the defender of Latin American freedom. On the other, international outlets denounced a new form of disguised imperialism. The truth, as always, was lost in the noise. And whoever dominates the discourse also dominates the perception of right and wrong. Channels and newspapers became ideological battlegrounds. Headlines were carefully crafted, videos edited with surgical precision, and statements strategically leaked. While the White House spoke of stabilization missions, European and Latin American networks highlighted violations of sovereignty and the suffering of civilians. Global public opinion, divided between sympathy and revulsion, became the main barometer of the success of these operations. It was the old art of shaping minds, now driven by algorithms and likes. And in this scenario, the CIA played an even more sophisticated game: information manipulation. False reports, out-of-context images, and coordinated online campaigns created a web so dense that even experienced analysts had difficulty distinguishing reality from pretense. The result? A war without borders, fought not in trenches, but on screens. And perhaps the most disturbing question that arises from this scenario is, who truly controls the truth when everyone has the power to distort it? Every political operation leaves its mark, but economic ones are the most enduring. When Trump authorized CIA operations in Venezuela, the market reacted like a living organism, instinctive and unpredictable. Oil prices soared, investors flocked to assets considered safe, and suddenly, all of Latin America seemed at risk. The sanctions imposed on the Venezuelan government disrupted supply chains, even affecting countries that had nothing to do with the conflict. The business world realized once again that geopolitics and economics are never separate. While Washington strengthened its trade barriers, China and Russia quietly moved forward with advantageous bilateral agreements. Chinese state-owned companies began taking over parts of the energy operations previously controlled by American multinationals, redrawing the global oil map. And this was no coincidence. It was strategy. For each sanction imposed, a new contract emerged, denominated in yuan or ruble, slowly reducing global dependence on the dollar. What seemed like a political maneuver turned into a far-reaching economic blow. The impact wasn't limited to figures. Small countries began to rethink their position in international trade, seeking alternatives outside the traditional axis. South America, Africa, and the Middle East began connecting in unprecedented ways, forming new networks of economic cooperation. And ironically, Trump's attempt to reassert American dominance ended up accelerating the opposite trend: the decentralization of global financial power. The board was shifting, and the pieces once again were in unexpected hands. There's a fine line between protecting interests and violating principles, and that's precisely where Trump's operations in Venezuela balanced. Behind the rhetoric of liberation and fighting drug trafficking lurked a question that goes beyond politics. How far can one country intervene in another under the guise of doing good? This is the open wound that every superpower tries to disguise, but which inevitably bleeds when exposed. And, it seems, history never tires of repeating this same lesson. Sovereignty, a concept that should be sacred, has become increasingly malleable. Governments are overthrown in the name of democracy, elections are manipulated in the name of freedom, and entire populations pay the price for decisions made thousands of miles away. The CIA, operating in the shadows, redefines what constitutes legitimate intervention, and this redefinition has an incalculable moral cost. Because when right and wrong become dependent on who tells the story, the entire world risks getting lost in the maze of justification. And perhaps this is the most uncomfortable point of all. Modern war has ceased to be fought between armies, and instead between ethical narratives. Trump, with his direct and confrontational style, has brought to light an uncomfortable truth: that global power is not sustained by virtue but by influence. And when influence becomes the measure of morality, only one question remains echoing behind the scenes. Who, after all, is truly saving the world, and who is merely saving themselves? The world has changed, but espionage has merely reinvented itself. What once required field agents, encrypted codes, and microfilm now happens with a click. The operations Trump authorized in Venezuela were just the tip of a much deeper iceberg. The silent war waged in cyberspace. Now the enemy doesn't need to cross borders. It simply needs to hack servers, manipulate information, or hack elections. Power no longer depends on military muscle, and now resides in the digital shadows. The CIA, the Russian FSB, the Chinese MSS, they all understood the same thing. The future belongs to those who control data, not territory. And Trump, even though he's not a technocrat, intuitively understood this. By authorizing secret missions, he also tested the limits of global surveillance and psychological manipulation. Each operation was both a rehearsal and a warning. The conflicts of the 21st century would not be fought in trenches, but over fiber optic cables and social media. It's a war of perception, and the first blow is disinformation. This new era of global espionage redefines everything we understand about security and power. Countries no longer compete just for oil, but for data, not for territory, but for digital influence. And the most fascinating or frightening thing is that we may never know where politics ends and espionage begins. Because, in the end, truth remains the first casualty of every secret war. And those who learn to manipulate the invisible ultimately discover that true power lies precisely in that which no one sees. Within the United States, Trump's authorizations for covert operations in Venezuela were seen not just as foreign policy, but as a domestic move. In a scenario of intense polarization, he knew that every action abroad echoed within them. For his supporters, he was living proof of a strong president, willing to protect the country against any threat. For his critics, it was yet another example of authoritarianism disguised as patriotism. And in this clash of narratives, the truth became just another campaign weapon. Congress was divided. While Republicans extolled the president's courage, Democrats called for transparency and limits on executive power in undeclared military actions. Tensions mounted, and the CIA, silent as ever, became the symbol of a government operating behind the scenes. Interestingly, even amid the controversy, polls showed a temporary increase in Trump's public approval rating, a clear reflection of how the idea of force, even today, wins hearts before it even wins minds. But over time, the patriotic feeling began to fade, giving way to deeper questions. To what extent must a leader be feared to be respected? And to what extent can national security justify secrets that shape the fate of entire nations? These questions hung in the air, hovering over Washington like an uneasy echo. And perhaps, deep down, Trump knew that his greatest battle was not against Maduro, but against the very system he once vowed to challenge. Every secret history, sooner or later, comes to light. And when it does, it doesn't just reveal facts, it reveals intentions, methods, and consequences. The operations authorized by Trump in Venezuela, still shrouded in mystery, have already left a legacy of harsh lessons. They showed the world that modern geopolitics is no longer just about treaties and speeches, but about algorithms, espionage, and invisible agreements. Every hidden move today is tomorrow's public chapter, and in the end, the truth always finds a way to emerge. These lessons, however, are not just for governments. They are also for those who observe, analyze, and try to understand how power truly works. The story of Trump and the CIA in Venezuela reminds us that the world is not governed solely by leaders, but by systems, invisible structures that outlast any mandate. And understanding this is the first step to deciphering the real game. Because power at its core doesn't change hands, it only changes faces. The future, as always, holds its own ironies. Perhaps, years from now, new documents will reveal details that seem unthinkable today. Perhaps other nations will follow suit, believing they can control the chaos. But one thing is certain: the more humanity tries to hide its secrets, the more they shape everyone's destiny. And those who learn to observe what is unsaid, the silence between the news reports, the subtext of speeches, discover that the true map of power is never complete. During the Trump administration, the CIA underwent a quiet metamorphosis. Once accustomed to discretion, the agency began operating under a new paradigm, that of strategic visibility. Trump understood the value of spectacle and, in a sense, exported this mindset to American intelligence. Operations were no longer merely secret. They also became political narratives, carefully balanced between secrecy and exposure. It was as if mystery, once a security tool, began to be used as an instrument of symbolic power. This transformation redefined the relationship between the state and its own secrets. The CIA, which had always operated as a shadow government, began to gain prominence in speeches and convenient leaks. Secrecy ceased to be merely protective. It became strategic. By giving freedom to bolder actions, Trump paved the way for more assertive intelligence, less bureaucratic, and at the same time, more vulnerable to public opinion. After all, the more visible the power, the greater the risk of being questioned. However, this new stance brought with it an inevitable contradiction. By strengthening the CIA, Trump also made it a target of internal and external disputes. Within the corridors of Washington, silent wars began between departments, each trying to protect its territory of influence. And outside, enemies and allies watched closely, learning from every move. In the end, what seemed like a show of force turned out to be a mirror of the empire's own weaknesses. And perhaps, without realizing it, Trump ushered in an era in which espionage became public, and the public, part of the espionage. Paradoxically, The covert actions intended to weaken Maduro ended up strengthening his position within Venezuela. When Trump authorized CIA operations, the regime found a new argument to consolidate its power: the external enemy. In fiery speeches, Maduro began to present himself as the defender of national sovereignty, transforming American pressure into political fuel. The people, divided between anger and fear, began to unite around a common narrative, that of resistance against foreign intervention. The effect was immediate. The Venezuelan government tightened internal controls, suppressed dissent, and strengthened alliances with Russia, China, and Iran. In response to sanctions and sabotage, Caracas developed new trade routes and expanded military agreements, showing the world that it still had its cards to play. The isolation the U.S. sought to impose ultimately pushed the country into the arms of other powers, creating a circle of political protection that became difficult to break. On the global chessboard, the threatened pawn became a rook. But perhaps the most profound impact was psychological. Every American denunciation of a narco-state was transformed within Venezuela into proof of imperialist persecution. Official propaganda dominated social media and the media, reinforcing the idea that the country was fighting against forces bent on destruction. And so, without realizing it, the U.S. helped shape the hero it claimed to be fighting. Because in politics, the more an enemy is attacked, the more it learns to use the attack as a shield. While the world's eyes turned to Caracas, foreign capitals reacted silently, but with calculated moves. Moscow reinforced its military presence in South America under the guise of technical cooperation, while Beijing increased investment in infrastructure and telecommunications in the region. For both, the American intervention in Venezuela was not just a local crisis, but a geopolitical opportunity. And, in the great game of power, every gap opened by the U.S. became a gateway for its rivals. Washington's traditional allies, on the other hand, expressed discomfort. The United Kingdom and France, although they maintained strategic relations with the U.S., were cautious when commenting on Trump's actions. They knew that openly supporting a covert operation would mean legitimizing the kind of power that could one day be used against them. NATO, silent as an audience watching a tightrope walker, limited itself to vague talk about international stability. Deep down, everyone knew the tide was turning, and that no one wanted to be the next target of America's shadows. Interestingly, smaller countries began to reposition themselves with unexpected intelligence. Nations in the Middle East and Asia, accustomed to living in the shadow of giants, saw American instability as an opportunity to assert autonomy. And while the world watched the showdown between Trump and Maduro, a new, almost invisible balance of power emerged. A balance that may, in the future, reveal that the greatest impact of U.S. actions was not what was seen in Venezuela, but what was unleashed on the rest of the world. Understanding Trump requires more than understanding politics. It requires understanding psychology. His leadership style has always been driven by calculated impulses, by an unusual blend of intuition and ego. He didn't make decisions based solely on data, but on perceptions, challenges, and often the need to prove a point to the world. When he authorized CIA operations in Venezuela, it wasn't just the president speaking. It was the strategist, the provocateur, and the player who sees the board as an arena of personal power. For him, politics and performance have always gone hand in hand. This stance shaped not only his actions, but also the behavior of those around him. Advisors, military personnel, and agents knew they worked under a leader who valued boldness over caution. Those who hesitated lost ground. Those who took risks gained prestige. This environment created a culture of quick decisions, where the fear of displeasing was conflated with the fear of appearing weak. It was as if the system itself breathed adrenaline, driven by the unpredictability of the man who commanded it. But what many fail to realize is that this leadership style, while effective in the short term, carries a steep emotional and political cost. When power mixes with vanity, the line between courage and recklessness becomes invisible. And it is precisely at this boundary that the greatest crises arise, those that begin with a gesture of confidence and end with an avalanche of consequences. Perhaps deep down, Trump's greatest psychological legacy is not what he built, but what he exposed. How much the world is still governed by egos, not ideals. For decades, the United States cultivated an image as a guardian of freedom, a democratic beacon amid the shadows of authoritarianism. But the covert operations in Venezuela cast this narrative in a new light. Suddenly, the world began to see not only the rhetoric, but also the contradictions behind it. Every covert action, every CIA leak, served as an uncomfortable reminder that American power doesn't always express itself through diplomacy. Sometimes it prefers to act in the shadows, and the entire planet took note. In many parts of the world, perceptions have shifted from admiration to distrust. Countries that once viewed the United States as a model have begun to view it with skepticism, questioning the coherence between its ideals and practices. Latin America, in particular, has revisited old wounds. Memories of interventions, coups, and manipulations that shaped decades of instability. Trump's actions in Venezuela have not only revived ghosts of the past, they have also reignited the debate over what freedom truly means when its price is imposed by another nation. Interestingly, this image crisis hasn't destroyed American power. It's only made it more complex. The world still fears and depends on the United States, but it no longer idealizes it. The empire remains standing, but now bears the weight of forced transparency, that of a giant that can no longer hide its own steps. And perhaps this is the new paradox of the Trump era, a power so visible that it has lost its right to mystery, and so indispensable that no one dares to distance itself from it completely. In every history of empire, there comes a point at which the argument of security becomes the mask of domination. The United States, under Trump, seemed to be walking dangerously close to this limit. By justifying covert operations in Venezuela in the name of global protection, the American government touched on an old human wound. To what extent can fear justify control? The rhetoric of defense is seductive. No one wants to feel vulnerable. But when it becomes state policy, it transforms into a silent form of modern-day colonization. This kind of power isn't imposed with chains, but with narratives. It's the idea that the world needs saving, and that only one nation has the right, or the duty, to do so. This belief feeds the collective ego and sustains the economy of permanent war, one that never ends, only changes its setting. The discourse of protection, repeated ad nauseum, breeds dependence. And the more the planet believes it needs an armed savior, the easier it is for power to perpetuate itself without resistance, in the name of a peace that never arrives. The danger lies in the fact that under this logic, freedom becomes conditional. Protected countries no longer make decisions for themselves. Allied governments begin to act according to interests that are not their own. Modern domination is subtle, technological, and cloaked in good intentions. And before we know it, we're already embedded in a system that dictates what we should fear, what we should support, and even what we should believe. Perhaps this is the darkest legacy of Trump's operations, not the conflict itself, but the idea that global security can justify anything. It's never been easier to shape thoughts, and never been more dangerous. Under the Trump administration, the manipulation of public opinion reached a new level. Social media became the battlefield where politics, propaganda, and psychology merged. Disinformation campaigns, programmed bots, and inflammatory speeches created an ecosystem in which truth lost its market value. With each presidential tweet, markets fluctuated, headlines rewrote themselves, and millions of people formed opinions based on carefully crafted fragments. It was the politics of the spectacle, and the public unwittingly was part of the show. Digital power became the new weapon of global domination. The CIA, accustomed to operating in the shadows, learned to operate with the light of screens. Fake news ceased to be mere rumors and became tools of social engineering. Platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube became geopolitical arenas, where every click was a political act and every share a vote of confidence or distrust. And, curiously, control of the narrative no longer depended on who governed, but on who could go viral first. This phenomenon forever changed the way power manifests itself. Leaders realized they no longer needed to convince, they just needed to move. People didn't want facts, they wanted stories that validated their beliefs. And Trump mastered this art. He understood that truth, in digital times, is not what is proven, but what is repeated. And perhaps this is the most enduring legacy of his era. A world where manipulating perceptions has become more effective than any army. Every revelation is born from a shadow. And, ironically, it was Trump's own secret actions that helped the world see what had always been there, but few dared to see. Power was never just a matter of force, but of narrative. And by revealing the behind-the-scenes workings of domination, the American government also ended up illuminating the mechanisms of global control. What was once untouchable began to be questioned, and what once seemed absolute truth began to be perceived as a construct. It was the beginning of a collective awakening, still timid, but inevitable. Modern geopolitics experiences a curious paradox. The more powers try to conceal their intentions, the more people learn to decipher them. Ordinary citizens, independent journalists, and alternative analysts have begun to form a new front of global consciousness. Networks, once used as instruments of manipulation, have also become tools of revelation. It's as if the system itself has created the means for its self-discovery. And with that, a new generation has begun to see that true power lies not in those who govern, but in those who awaken. And perhaps this is the most hopeful part of this whole story. Because, in the end, no covert operation is more powerful than a mind that learns to question. The empire of shadows still exists, but it is no longer invincible. Each person who decides to think, doubt, and seek to understand what lies behind the headlines becomes, in itself, an act of resistance. And those who observe closely realize the shadows only seem eternal until someone turns on the light. The world has changed since covert operations returned to the political arena. What Trump did in Venezuela wasn't just an isolated act. It was a sign that the era of total transparency is an illusion. Powers have returned to acting as they did in the old days, spying, manipulating, interfering. The difference is that now, everything happens in front of cameras, satellites, and social media. The secret is no longer in the action, it's in the intention. And deciphering intentions on this new playing field has become the true challenge of modern diplomacy. The future of geopolitics will inevitably be hybrid, part public, part invisible. Wars will be fought across multiple dimensions: military, cyber, economic, and psychological. Alliances will shift as quickly as algorithms, and truths will be temporary, shaped by whoever controls the flow of information. Trump, perhaps unintentionally, accelerated this transition. His boldness in breaking protocols and challenging traditions paved the way for an era in which politics is more performative, espionage more technological, and power more decentralized. But something even deeper is happening. Humanity seems to have crossed a point of no return, where control of the narrative has become as valuable as control of territory. The question is no longer who will win the next war, but who will tell the story of it. Because power, in the end, always belongs to those who dominate the plot. And it is there, between the lines of history, that the true battlefield begins to take shape. In the end, Trump's operations in Venezuela revealed more about the world than about himself. They showed that we live in an era where the lines between truth and manipulation, justice and self-interest, security and control, have become nearly indistinguishable. And perhaps this is the most valuable lesson of all: understanding that, on the global chessboard, The pieces move long before the public knows the game has begun. Power doesn't flaunt itself. It insinuates itself, infiltrates, and disguises itself. And that's precisely what makes it so fascinating and so dangerous. But what would you do if you discovered that the next big decisions that will change the world are already being made, right now, in rooms where no one votes, and where laws serve only as window dressing? This reflection isn't just about politics. It's about consciousness. It's about not accepting the pre-made version of history and seeking to see what's behind the headlines, because those who understand the invisible master the visible. And before the next chapter of this game begins, do what few do. Question, seek to understand, investigate, and connect the dots. Knowledge is the only weapon that cannot be censored. So if this content made you think, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and continue learning with me about the behind the scenes of global power. After all, what comes next could change everything, and you'll want to be among those who saw it first.